Greetings, it's Jason Hill of the Night Owl Modeler blog. Over the last several years, people have asked me to make a video of my techniques weathering Flatcar decks. In April 2020, I shot the following video using an OwlMtModels F50 series Flatcar. An F&C P11 class B&O Flatcar will also make a short cameo appearance. Over my years at the La Mesa Club in San Diego, I've built and weathered hundreds of cars for service. The advertisement models for OwlMtModels, including the flat cars such as SP43, 745, the modular lumber loads, and the beat racks, often need to be different, as the weathering on these models is only painted on to show how the stock model comes. However, what happens if you want to distress the physical deck of the model? That's what we'll be getting into today. Okay, here's the two OwlMtM flat cars that have painted on weathering on the decks. These decks have not been scraped up or distressed in any way. This is all done with apple barrel paints and brush techniques that we'll be getting into. This flat car here is Pacific Electric 3669, and this is a car that I've kit bashed to include the brake rigging along in here, which the Pacific Electric used for their 45-foot radius curves. This car I also decided to start tearing up the deck on, and if I can get a good angle on the deck here, we can see the deck has actually been distressed and scratched up to a fair extent. Here's Southern Pacific 41186. This is a car that I did more extreme weathering on and tearing up the deck on. We'll get into how we did that now. Okay, as with most of my techniques, these are all fairly simple. We're going to be using a razor saw. This is a Zona saw, I believe it is. Could be X-Acto blade. You know, any of these really work. This one's got a fairly fine tooth. This one I believe I bought as a 4-set, and you can see the fine teeth of the blade there. This will be for dragging across the surface and also cutting some gashes in the deck. Next up, we have a fine tooth. This is like a keyhole saw. Again, very fine blade, and these are probably 30 or 40 thousandths between blades, the teeth, and we'll be using this to scratch and gouge into the deck a little bit more aggressively. One of the cheap craft brushes that I use. This one's been kind of chewed up. It has its bristles are a bit worn. You can see they're blossomed a little bit. That's not really a problem for what we're going to be doing in this exercise. I've also used some sanding sticks, such as this small one. These are kind of handy to have around. This one's actually a fairly rough coarseness. I'd classify this as maybe medium or coarse. Could do probably a little bit more coarse than this even, but this one tends to work for knocking down too many burrs, things like that. With the plastic scratching on the deck, you actually do want to have some fuzz coming up like splinters and so forth. It adds to the effect. This is my favorite carbide scribe. This is generally useful for going in and doing point work and scratching exactly where you want to have individual board lines and grain. It's very useful. Number 11 X-Acto blades and chisel blades such as this are also useful in some aspects of the weathering, although generally I don't believe we're going to be using a blade like this in this particular project. This is an OwlMtModels F50 series deck. This is injection molded plastic, and as you can see, there is a nice grain or board lines already injection molded into the kit. There is no fine grain detail for each board because that's more complicated to put in the mold, and then it makes every model the same. So this is why the weathering techniques I'm going to be using show up nicely, because you get to choose to do exactly what you want, and each car can be a little bit different. So let's get into it. This car here is basically a finished flat car. Normally I would do this without the brake wheel attached, but I'll show that we can work around that. This deck's already been weathered. That will form kind of a nice backdrop. As I start scratching the deck, you'll be able to see what parts I'm tearing up more than others. So we'll see if I can do this around the camera, since I'm behind the camera and trying to do this at the same time. So one technique is getting the tip of the blades and just starting to scratch the deck. This technique goes fairly quickly, and I'm going to switch back to the bigger saw at this point. So I can grab the deck and drag the blade across, and you can see that that's starting to tear up the surface just a little bit. But I'm going to get a little bit more aggressive here, and one of the tricks is doing shallow work like this. And I can just come in kind of randomly and scuff the deck up. I can also push on the side of the blade with my thumb as I do this, and that creates other effects. I can feel it gouging into certain boards, and just a few strokes you can see already that there's some damage happening in here from this, and a few more strokes like that, and then I could probably come in aggressively and do some more vertical marks. That's getting some effect. I'm going to flip it around and do some reverse angle to make sure the handle doesn't try to come off this. So I can work across here. Now I'm not worrying too much about cutting quote towards my fingers at this point, because I'm not cutting this way, I'm cutting down, and I'm kind of using the side of the blade. And now that that's torn up somewhat, I can come in with the tip here and tear up individual boards more with the tip. I'm actually doing this as a push without a lot of force. It's be very annoying if I actually stab myself in the finger right now, but we'll avoid doing that. The other thing I can do is I can tear it back towards myself this way with the blades. This is using multiple teeth, and you can see now there's already plastic splinters and so forth. We're getting some fairly good effects from that. Probably remove some of those burrs. I can of course get out my carbide scribe here as well and start doing some of this with the scribe. The scribe's more for finish work, and if you want to go in and do individual grain. Sometimes it's fun to sit down and work through scribing individual boards. And usually I'd try to set up an angle where I could go all the way across, or at least in a larger section. So this board's more cross-grained. With this, you can also do these boards where there's like a knot or something that's making the grain go in weird directions. Cross back over and use this blade. You can also get some pretty good gouges into the deck edge with the smaller blade like this. Like those ends of those boards have chipped off. So that's the basic technique. I'm going to cut ahead and do some more of the deck. Okay, there I've done a couple of crossways gouges. I'm not too worried about that since loads were drugged sideways across the decks and so forth. So again, not too worried about that. Knock off some of this fuzz. Okay, I'm going to knock down some of this light fuzz here with the sanding stick. This is very lightly going over this. This is just to rub off some of the big chunks that would probably come off. And look unrealistic. That's pretty good. Some of the big chunks, and when I come in at a real shallow angle with the blade like this, what I'm actually sometimes trying to do is to get the board top to actually lift up slightly. If I can get in here, like on this back side here, it's actually lifting the surface of the deck slightly, like here. You know, that's sometimes actually what I'm trying to go for. So that can look really cool if you can get the top of the board to start to lift. And it'll look like the top of the board's breaking or something like that's going on. I'm going to ease up a little bit towards the brake wheel end of the car here. I'm rocking the blade here just a little bit so that some of these board delineations are a little bit deeper and rougher. Okay, switch to the back to the fine blade here and do a little bit more work with it. Okay, just finish up the far end of the deck here. The other trick here is just to take this whole side of the blade and just drag it across the deck. Scratch up the deck. Yeah, that looks pretty reasonable. I might come back in here and just do a little bit more fine roughing here. The more you use a blade like this, razor saw, the more you'll learn what effects you can get from dragging the blade sideways, pushing across like this, for example, just general grunging up the deck with scratches. You'll learn exactly all the different little tricks and techniques to do this kind of stuff. Again, I'm not using the carbide scribe a whole lot since most of this is just gross work that I'm doing at this point. If there was some particular fine detail work that I want to do, say like put grain in here between the stake pockets or something, or out here, I could sit here and scribe it. But I'm trying to keep this video fairly short. After a short cut to deal with cleaning up the workspace here, let's have a quick look at the effects on the deck. Get this to refocus. There we go. So now the deck has been pretty aggressively chewed up. There's little splinters left all over the place here. Some of those I'm going to leave on the deck. This is kind of nice in here where it's actually got some fragments of the boards. Same thing over here. There's some pieces that are lifted up and twisted a little bit. The burrs and so forth. That'll probably come off a little bit, but some of this in here will be ideal. And over here, the way the deck's just been chewed up and broken will look very nice once the weathering and so forth is finished up. Now we're going to be using apple barrel paint, and right now I got on my brush some water, and I'm going to start wetting the deck. And the deck should be a little bit wet for this technique to work. Basically what we're now going to do is get a little bit of paint on the brush, like that. And I'm going to start streaking this onto the wood. I'm using a neutral gray right now, which will just give us a good base color, and we'll start working both darker and lighter from there. And I think I might grab a piece of paper towel to keep this from messing up my nice white surface. Alright, we're back after a quick bit of support here from our local paper towel supplier. Alright, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit here. This technique goes pretty fast, but I want to make sure the camera's in a good position to catch this. TSG Multimedia and I did a co-op collaboration project last year in 2019, doing a video on how to do this style of weathering on a steel box Pennsylvania Express reefer. And so you can refer to that video for the basic technique. This is a slightly different technique as I'm using it on wood, and I am trying to get the wood grain now to show up. So it's a little bit different, but still using the same acrylic materials, same quick techniques. All right. Well, I want to have fairly good coverage. I don't want to have it completely covering everything. So after a minor interruption, I've come back. The gray base coat has dried pretty thoroughly now. I'm going to actually use this opportunity to use a black wash. Right now the brush is loaded fairly heavy with black with some water on it, but I'm going to try to use some more water to thin it out as I spread it around on the deck, and then we're going to wipe it off with a paper towel. So let's get into it here. This looks really heavy right now, but I'm not too worried about that because I'm going to be grabbing some more liquid here and just scrubbing this around the deck. This will be used to get into all the little dark nooks and crannies of the deck that we've carved into it recently. This should also help us easily see where the where most of the damage to the deck is. So it should help for this video's purposes as well. So and I'm trying to get the heaviest of the black to work down into the nooks and crannies at this point. That's looking pretty good. It's a bit darker up here on this edge. And here. Rinse out the brush. And I'm going to grab my scrap paper towel and just lightly wipe down the deck. And that took a little bit too much off over here, it looks like, so I'll lightly come back with the damp brush. It really soaked most of this up. That looks pretty good. This area in here really got scratched up, so that's why a lot of the dark pigment's hiding out there. See if any more of that will move over there. That looks pretty good. And as we can see, this deck really didn't take very long to scratch up like this. Now it's just going to be a matter of adding a few more colors and varying the weathering effect a little bit. The gray color I used was Pewter Gray. It's 20580E by Apple Barrel. And let's see if I can get a view of that in here. And I may be using this, we'll see. This is Chestnut. This is actually pretty close to SP Flatcar Red. So if I want to add any overspray or something like that, this is usually a subtle blending color that I use. It's 21391E Chestnut. Let's see. One of my good old standbys here is Territorial Beige. So that's 2058E Territorial Beige. That's one of the colors I usually use, so we'll line up to get ready to use that soon. Khaki is another color I use a lot of. That one's 21390E. These all end in E for some reason. I wonder if that's just their code for acrylic. And light mocha is another nice color that works pretty well. That's 21489E, light mocha. So that should have given this a little bit of time to start to dry. Yeah, that's pretty good right now. I'm not worrying too much about the deck ends. Those I already weathered in the previous version. Let's see if I can get the camera to refocus on the edge there. Yeah, that weathering will pretty much take care of itself. So I think next I'll grab a little bit of the Territorial Beige. And I'm just working out of the top of the lid here. Grab a little bit on the brush. And usually this I'm just going to kind of scuff in like this onto the wood. And it blends pretty well in pretty quickly. One thing I can do is as I go with this, it'll actually start turning into almost a dry brush using the raw color. Some of these you can almost go down the length of the deck, just hitting the high spots of the boards. I'm trying not to cover up too much of the black that came in earlier. And I might even do a little bit of dry brushing technique on some of this. One trick I use sometimes is I'll mix maybe a little bit of gray in with the light mocha or the Territorial Beige. Don't be afraid to mix colors too, because that'll give you some extra variations. And I'll probably go for a little bit of burnt umber, bring a little bit of darker browns into this. In this case, like the burnt umber and stuff. Let's see if I can keep this in the range of the camera here. It's a little heavy, but I'm going to see if the dry brushing effects will be able to balance that out a little bit. And of course I can always grab a little bit of water and help turn that into a little bit of a wash. Apologies if my framing's getting a little off here, but we'll see what we can do. And there's a little bit of color. I'm going to grab a little bit of extra water. One thing with this acrylic paint you need to be a little careful of is lifting the previous colors up that you've already done. Alrighty, so again I let that dry for a couple of minutes. I'm now going to go over it with a little bit of khaki and light mocha probably. These will be just basically to add a little bit of highlights. These colors both work well from what I've found in terms of like California dust and colors like that where you're just trying to add a little bit of highlights. I find a lot of models get too dark to look like they're natural on a lot of layouts where they have very light scenery colors in terms of the dirt color. Sometimes I have to be a little careful what colors I'm using. There we go. Getting it a little... It's nice to get these colors kind of flaky almost, where they just kind of give a light scrub of their color onto the model. I'm going to go ahead and wet the model here a little bit on this section of deck. This is just water. Very small amount of paint now. Scuffle that off. Again, I'm trying to use pretty minimal amounts of paint. There we go. That's the effect that I'm trying to get. Just very dry paint now for these highlights that are just going to stick to the top of the boards. It's kind of tricky to get it, and I'm trying to use the smallest amount of paint that I can get basically on the tips of the bristles. So as it unloads on the model, it just catches the high spots. I'll move it around a little bit as it carries. Still seems a little dark in the middle of the car. I'm not trying to completely make the deck the same color. I don't want to do that. Likewise, I don't really want to have super weird looking parts of the deck. I'll probably go a little bit up here with some of this powder dust looking shades. Of course, you can do this with chalks and things like that too, but with all the challenges of getting the chalks to set properly and not come off over time, or if somebody handles the car, I found that the paint just works a little better for long-term survivability of the weathering effects that you're trying to do. That was maybe almost a little bit too much, but that did get the effect that I wanted of the, oops, bump the camera. Get the effect of the highlights going on in this area of the deck. I'll probably do a little bit more in this area next. As I'm doing some of this, I am actually scrubbing fairly hard onto the model. That's one of the reasons why I'm using a older brush that's not going to be very good for doing real nice fine work. This is just kind of crusty work here at this point. See if we can gain a little focus on what we're doing here. I'm going to try zooming in as I do this area, this next area here. That was quite a bit too much, but I'll move that around a little bit, see if we can blend that a bit better. There's nothing saying the finger can't work too. At this point, I'm probably going to go for a little bit of water and just kind of highlight the deck here and see if I can lift a little bit of what I've been doing off. Probably going to need to go back to using a little bit of the burnt umber here. About doing like a burnt umber wash here real quick. That's getting back a bit of the board detail. That looks good. So basically you can just work back and forth with these different colors and adjust the shades of how it's all working out. Might even go back and risk a little bit of black if I really want to get some more contrast in some of these spots. In this case, by having the dark paint done with a more of a wash, I can kind of rub off the highlights that, or rub the dark paint off. It came from the wash, and reveal the lighter shades of highlight that I've used before. So let's see if I can do this end of the car. The same technique, if I don't catch it too badly on the... Yeah, it's looking pretty decent. That deck's looking fairly good now. I think at this point, you've seen the different techniques now. I'm going to jump between a few photographs of the other models here, or maybe I'll just put them in here next to it. This new car at the bottom is Pacific Electric 3669, and let's see here. Okay. This car here is the 41186, and these are both, all three of these are using the same technique. You can see that this car that we're just working on here could have a little bit more highlights put in. The Pacific Electric car here, I used an airbrush and shot a little bit of black to simulate like an oil stain from some machinery leaking, and then I came back and blended it a little bit with a little bit more of the acrylic work, just so that it wasn't quite so stark. The other thing to look at here is so all of these are done on the basic Flatcar deck here on the Owl Mountain car. So we turned this into these. I also have recently been working on a F&C resin kit, and this is actually the resin deck. Okay, so we're back now. We have the F&C flat car here. This is a P11 B&O flat car, painted black, obviously. I haven't really started weathering the side of the car yet, but I went ahead and did the deck, and this deck has been scratched up and distressed the same way that I did on the Owl Mountain cars. This one started as a gray wet resin, and again, using the same techniques and colors and so forth, I've torn it up a little bit to look like wood. Just as an experiment, I also have a laser kit deck, which is this one, and I'm partway through weathering it. I masked off some areas to see what it would look like if I weathered those differently to look like replacement sections of deck. I think probably the next step to do on the wood deck, which I haven't done yet, is I need to seal the gray part. And then once it's sealed, I can go over it with the same kind of black washes and just bring out a little bit more of the detail that I scratched into the wood. There is that detail is in the wood. The problem is I just can't get a dark enough wash on it right now without staining the whole section of the deck black, and it would actually go down into the wood grains and darken it too much, so I don't really want to do that. So that's where we're at with these at the moment. I think what I'm going to do is set up a bigger shot, and we'll look at several decks that I've worked on. Alright, so here we have a selection of flat car decks of various cars I'm working on. The car here on the far left is the Southern Pacific Maintenance Away 3605. Then we have the car that we just worked on, and then here we have the Pacific Electric 3669, Southern Pacific 41-186, the B&O Flatcar. This is one of the F50-16 kit bashes that I've been working on. Originally a red caboose car, and the last car over here on the far right side is the Southern Pacific 43-745. These two models just have painted on effects on the deck. Basically none of this heavy distressing that we've been working on. These four models here have the technique we just showed, and the 3605 over here has some sections in the middle of the deck have the effects that we were just showing, but then in some sections I've done heavier damage where I've actually cut away sections of the deck and replaced some of it, and I've covered that in my blog in part 3 of the Open Decks article. Okay, just for completeness sake, here's a more detailed view of the 3605, which shows the deck weathering. These are actually wooden boards that have been put in to replace and then painted to match the plastic parts of the deck. The section of the deck where I use the current technique that I'm showing right now is this mid section of the deck right here. And this section of the deck I was able to do some pretty intense cutting with the saw blade, and over here with the X-Acto blade. So those areas were the techniques that I've tried to expand on with these newer projects. Okay, here's a close-up view of the SP41-186 deck, and I'm just going to pan the car slowly across in front of the camera so you can see all the different textures and paint colors and techniques and how they look when they're on a car. Here's the Pacific Electric 3669, and again I'm going to try to do a slow pan so you can see all the textures of the distressed deck. This deck's probably moderately damaged compared to the 41-186, which is more heavily damaged. Okay, here's the current version of the car that we were working on during this video. The section in the middle there looks pretty good. I might do a little bit more on these areas in here. They look like they could use a little bit more definition. Okay, so I'm going to try doing another quick black wash on the section of the deck in here. And do a quick wipe. And off the tabletop too. I didn't put the paper towel back like I should have. We'll go ahead and do that right now. Okay. So that adds a bit more definition to it, certainly. I'm going to get a little bit more wash color or wash, just water. See if I can even out this edge just a little bit more. That looks pretty good. It's kind of resulted in a bit more black down this side than I was expecting, so I'll clean that off the side of the car a bit. Looks like I could go back in here and put a little dark in that area. And let's see if I can do one more quick darkening on this area over here. So I'm going to go ahead and get a little bit of, actually even that amount of wash is working. That kind of wick into the deck a little bit. Alright. There's also a trick where you wait just to the right time and then you go across it and take off the wet paint. Right now it's still a bit wet, for that trick to work. I can still see the water's pretty glossy. It's probably just about right over here. Just a few strokes over there. There we go. Don't know if you heard that. The neighbor dog just went nuts. There we go. Yeah, so that's looking pretty good now. The deck's got some good color variations in it. These lines here where I deeply scratched the deck in here, this is actually where the saw blade was being drugged completely across the deck on edge. And in here we have some of this nice sections where it's kind of torn up and loose, splinters and stuff like that. You wouldn't want to jump onto this part of the deck. I can try to scuff the deck off a little bit more over there. That looks pretty good. There's some light colors popping back through there in a few of the places. So it's these subtle variations that I'm really enjoying getting to pop on these kind of projects. I might even be able to come back in with just a hair more light colors and just do a very few marks like that, just to add a few more color variations in the deck, so it's not in the places where it's a little bit monotone, just a little bit more detailing. This is khaki that I'm using at the moment. Again, with this very small amount of paint, I'm basically only putting paint on 1 or 2 bristles right now on this kind of flared end of the brush. And let's see if I go back and grab a little bit of Territorial Beige. That would probably be a good color right now. Yeah, a little bit of highlights there. Part of learning how to do this is when to stop. And I think we're just about there. You could sit here and go back and forth and rub it down and start over and go back and forth a bunch of times. I just generally try to go until there's a little bit of nice texture, like that, on the boards. Some of these are a little extreme. You know, that's the other thing is, if you have a fleet of cars, it's not like you have to have every car the same, and you don't have to have every car being completely typical. A lot of times if you just model a car with, quote, typical weathering, you'll get some kind of average glob of weathering colors and things like that. Don't be afraid to have each car being a little bit different, a little bit special. So I think that pretty well wraps up this deck project on this car, and this is a good example, again, like I said, of taking a model that's already otherwise finished. Obviously there's a few paint holidays here and there from wear and tear already on this model that I need to go do some touch-up work on the Freight Car Red, but you know, that model is pretty much there in terms of the deck. I'm pretty happy with how that deck's looking, and hopefully we'll be seeing it in other photographs and other projects in the background. So hope you've enjoyed this, and have a good night.